The Chevy Silverado EV and its sibling, the GMC Sierra EV, are the longest range and fastest charging electric pickup trucks available today. I recently posted a video in which I charged a Silverado EV from 10% to 80% and did my full analyzing of that charging session, at which time I promised I would follow it up with a complete 0 to 100% charge recording and analysis with all the charts and graphs. That's what we're going to do here today, so let's get into it. So in the video I posted a couple weeks ago of the 10 to 80% charging session, I was really impressed with the Silverado's charging ability. We added about 200 miles of driving range in, I think it was 18 minutes, under 20 minutes. We added 200 miles of driving range, which is fantastic, especially when you consider that the Silverado is a big truck. Weighs 9,000 pounds. It only averages somewhere around 2 miles per kilowatt hour. So you've got to pump a lot of kilowatt hour into the pack in order to be able to go 200 miles. So we talked a lot about how quickly the vehicle can reclaim miles, particularly when you charge it at a low state of charge. In this video here today, we're going to analyze a little bit deeper. We're going to talk a little bit about, say, the first half of the charging session and the second half of the charging session. And after analyzing the Silverado a little bit more closely than I did the first time, I have a slightly different opinion of its charging abilities. And while it's really great for that first 20 minutes or so, the performance really does drop off after you've added that first, say, 200 miles of driving range. So let's really get into it and analyze the full charging curve from 0 to 100%. And then what I'm going to do is compare the 0 to 100% charging session with my 10 to 80% charging session to see if it's very similar, if it's repeatable. What you really want with electric vehicles is the charging to be very similar from session to session. You want to know what you're going to get. You don't want to plug in one day and it takes you 30 minutes to go 10 to 50%, and then the next day it takes 40 minutes. Some electric vehicles have really consistent charging prowess. Some don't necessarily do that. So we're going to take a look and see if these two sessions are relatively close as far as the charging curve, the miles per minute added, and all that stuff. Of course, we'll enter all the charts and graphs that we always do. And then at the end, I'm going to show you my master charging chart for the Silverado EV. That's a new chart that I introduced recently, and the followers seem to like it. I know I've had many people comment and said that they downloaded it and printed it and use it when they're charging their electric vehicle on the road. So we'll get to that at the very end. But for now, let's take a look at the time-lapse recording from 0 to 100% before we start comparing it with the 10 to 80. So let's get into that next. State of Charge is powered by Qmerit. After I help you decide which electric vehicle charger you're going to buy, follow the link in the description of my videos and have the installation professionals at Qmerit install it. And by following the link, Qmerit will waive the $200 on-site inspection fee. But in order to have that fee waived, you have to follow the link in the description of my videos. Within a minute, the Silverado is pulling 500 amps and is charging at nearly the station's limit of 350 kilowatt, and it rips along at that rate for the first 10 minutes of charging. Now I'm going to stop the recording briefly here so we can look at the results of 10 minutes of charging. You can see the Silverado is already at 22% state of charge, and the station has dispensed 55.6 kilowatt hour. That's good enough for about 100 miles of driving. Not bad for a 9,000 pound full-size pickup truck that only averages about 2 miles per kilowatt hour. Okay, let's start the recording back up. Now you can see after 10 minutes of charging, the Silverado begins to request less current and holds at about 400 amps, which is nearly 300 kilowatt for a while. But after 17 minutes of charging, when the state of charge is at 38%, the Silverado begins to drastically lower its power intake, and the charging rate drops all the way down to a low of 139 kilowatt at 49% state of charge. But that's when things get better and the Silverado begins taking in more power. I'm going to stop the recording at 50% here to take a look at where we are. So after about 28 minutes, we've added half the battery back, which is good for about 225 miles of driving. The station has dispensed 122 kilowatt hour, but not all of that has ended up into the battery pack. There's always charging losses, and the higher the charging rate, the more the losses due to heat. And also the Silverado's thermal management system has been cranking away the whole time to keep the cells and components cool, and that uses a good amount of energy also. From here, the charging rate begins to climb back up over 200 kilowatt, and it peaks at 210 kilowatt at 73% state of charge. And it's at that point when the vehicle begins to gradually lower the charging rate until it's 100% charged. We reach 80% state of charge in 52 minutes, and we're still charging at 128 kilowatt, which isn't bad, but considering the size of the Silverado's battery pack, it's not that great of an accomplishment either. But from there on out, the Silverado took 46 more minutes before it was 100% charged and shut off. And we reached that after charging for 1 hour and 38 minutes. So you can get 80% charged in 52 minutes, and it takes nearly that long to charge the final 20%. Again, demonstrating why you shouldn't charge much past 80% on a DC fast charger unless you really need to. So we completed the full 0 to 100% charging session on the Silverado EV in 1 hour and 38 minutes. And the station dispensed 237.75 kilowatt hour. Now, GM states that the usable capacity for the Silverado is 205 kilowatt hour. When I did my 70 mile an hour highway range test, I was able to access 213 kilowatt hour, actually almost 214. And if you use that number compared to what the station dispensed here, this is about 10% more, which is kind of average for what I see with DC fast charge sessions. Somewhere around the 8 to 12 or 13% is going to be losses due to heat and the thermal management and all the systems in the vehicle operating while you're charging. So this seems normal to me, even though, geez, there's a lot of kilowatt hours going into that pack. Okay, so you can see, at least the first 20 minutes, the Silverado is a beast. It adds miles and kilowatt hour like nothing else out there, truck-wise at least. But then it falls off quite a bit. I really think GM could do a little bit of a better job on that second half of the charging session. And, you know, it still held a decent charging rate. But the pack is huge, well over 200 kilowatt hour, and larger packs can sustain higher charging rates deep into the pack. So I really think there's some room for improvement here. Not really in the front end. You know, that first 20 minutes, about as good as you're going to get. But the next 20 minutes, I really do think GM could do a little bit better with that. And, you know, let's take a look at it on paper with my charts and graphs. But before we do that, you may have noticed at the end, the EVgo station didn't show the price for the charging session. I don't know why it does. It always says not available now, but then you get an email like a minute later and it tells you how much it cost. Now that was a 0 to 100% charging session. You can see how many kilowatt hour I pumped into the pack, a lot. That charging session cost me $150. So it costs more than what it would cost to refill the diesel or gasoline on any version of the Silverado combustion vehicle. But that doesn't tell the whole story. I was charging on an EVgo charging station, and I don't have a plan with EVgo, so I pay the full rate. If I did have one of the monthly plans, which I'm going to sign up for now, the reason why I didn't have the plan was there hadn't been EVgo stations in my area that were reliable, that were the 350 kilowatt stations that I would use for charge recordings. And quite honestly, I don't need the DC fast charge on the road that often, so I didn't have a plan with them. I do have a plan with Electrify America, but not with EVgo. But now I'm going to do that because if you pay $13 a month, you get 30% off. And that would make a huge difference in this charging. I mean, it was a $150 session. So you could do the math. It would have been a substantial saving. It would have saved me at least a couple of months of membership if I would have just signed up for it then. But I'm going to sign up for it now. But as a comparison, if I charged it home, right here in the State of Charge garage, where I pay about 16 cents per kilowatt hour, that charging session would have cost me $38. So $150 at an EVgo station, $38 at home. Big difference. I know most areas of the country, it's going to cost less to charge at home, even if you have one of the plans that the networks offer. But look at that difference. That's like 75% more, $38, $150. But in any event, that's what it cost. It was a very expensive charging session. EV charging on the road can be extremely expensive. It can cost more than gasoline at times if you don't have a charging plan with the network that you're charging with, and depending on where you are in the country. Okay, with that said, now let's take a look at this 0 to 100% charging session on paper, with the charging curve, charging power chart, and also the time to charge chart, where you're going to see how many miles per minute were added and how many minutes it took to add 50, 100, 150, 250, and so forth miles of driving range. All right, so on the charging power chart, on the x-axis, you'll see the state of charge percent, and on the y-axis, that's the charging power in kilowatt. And you can say as soon as we plugged in, bang, 350 kilowatt. It holds it all the way to around 22, 23% state of charge. That happened in about 10 minutes, if you remember, during the recording. That little section there represents about 100 miles of driving range, and we did it in about 10 minutes, which is really fantastic. And at that point, that's when the Silverado lowers its charging rate a little bit down, just under 300 kilowatt. But then it creeps back up to just about 300 kilowatt. And at the 35% state of charge point, it begins the big drop in power that we noted during the recording. And while this might appear to be thermal throttling because it goes all the way down and then creeps back up again later, I don't believe it is, because I charged the Silverado quite a few times now, and I've seen this after a certain period of time on all of the recordings. I think that's actually programmed into the charging curve for the vehicle to slow down its charging rate, maybe balance the cells a little bit, and then begin this increase back up to where it peaks at over 200 kilowatts, right around 72, 73%. And then it begins the final linear ramp down here to 100% state of charge. Now, this isn't a bad charging curve. I'd love to see them do away with this big dip here to under 150 kilowatts. And if they can actually make the charging curve look a little bit more like this, it would be fantastic. But I'm sure GM has a reason. Their engineers have this programmed in. Perhaps the cells need a little bit of a break at that time, or maybe we'll see improvements in the future. They can do software updates to improve the charging curve. We've seen GM do that before, as well as the other manufacturers. So while this really isn't terrible, it looks like they've got some room for improvement, especially with such a large battery pack. I think it should be able to sustain a little bit more power intake for a little bit longer, at least up to the 70 or 80% mark. We should be able to keep the power draw over 200 kilowatts, I would think, and eliminate the real low drop down here that really slowed things up right around 50% state of charge. Next up, we're going to take a look at a chart I just started adding to my DC fast charging analysis, the C-rate chart. As you can see, it looks similar to the charging power chart that we just looked at. It's just squished down a bit. C-rates demonstrate the rate of discharge or recharge of a battery based on 1 hour. Obviously, in this case, we're going to look at the recharge rate. So if a battery has a C rate of 1, it will fully recharge from 0 to 100% in exactly 1 hour. If it had a C rate of 2, it would fully recharge in a half an hour. Okay, so the Silverado's battery has a usable capacity of about 210 kilowatt hour, so that's what I use to make this chart. I know most people that aren't really big EV geeks like me probably aren't going to be very interested in this particular information, but I'm showing it for a reason. While the Silverado EV charges at a very high rate, of 350 kilowatt for a while in the beginning, that's not even a 2C rate because of the size of the battery. There are EVs that charge for a while at speeds over 2C, and in doing so stress the pack much more than what GM is doing here. And for more than half the charging session, the Silverado is charging at under a 1C rate, which in this case is 210 kilowatt, and that's not really overly impressive. Yes, the Silverado EV charges exceptionally well for the first 18 to 20 minutes, but after that, the charging is really just average for a new EV in 2024. And next up, let's take a look at the time to charge chart. This, in my opinion, is actually the most important chart because it tells people how long they have to stay at the DC fast charger before they can unplug and move on. With this chart, we're going to explore how long it takes to add driving miles back and also how many miles per minute you're adding while you're charging at a particular state of charge. So let's get into it. What you want to see in this chart is a more vertical climb like you see here in the beginning. Take a look at the first 20 minutes. The line is very vertical. It goes up pretty sharply and then it starts to become more horizontal. That's the point where you saw the vehicle starting to lower its charge rate right after around 20% charging. And what I like to look at is how many miles per minute you're adding as you're charging. And the more vertical the line, you're going to add more miles per minute. So let's take a look at the difference from the beginning to the end of the charging session with regards to miles per minute added. You can see for about the first 16 or 17 minutes, we're adding 10 miles for every minute of charging. That's a very good rate of charge. Now take a look at the 5 miles per minute line here. You can see for most of the charging session, after 20 minutes of charging, this charging line doesn't have a more aggressive vertical climb than the 5 miles per minute line. So that tells you that after about 20 minutes of charging, we barely charged at a rate higher than 5 miles per minute. So for a charging session that started out so great, after 20 minutes, the rest of the charging session really isn't that good. Now let's take a look at how many miles per minute are added in each 10-minute interval of this charging session. Okay, so you can see in this box here that I have two columns, one for the EPA rated range and one for my 70 mile an hour highway range test that I did with the 2024 Silverado EV RST First Edition. I'm not going to read both columns down because they're so close. The EPA range rating for that vehicle was 250 miles per charge, and I drove it 241 miles in that range test. So as you can see, the numbers are really close, and I'm just going to read off the EPA range rating here. In the first 10 minutes of charging, we averaged 10 miles of range for every minute charging. That's actually very good. And then from the 10-minute point to 20 minutes, we averaged 8.3 miles per minute charging. Still very good. But then look how the miles per minute drops off a cliff from 20 minutes to 30 minutes. That's when we saw the Silverado really lower its charge rate. It went down to 4.3 miles for every minute charging, which quite honestly, after only 20 minutes of charging is very bad for an electric vehicle. Now look at 30 to 40 minutes. If you remember, the Silverado recovered and started charging a little bit quicker here, and we averaged 5.6 miles of range for every minute charging. 40 minute to 50 minute, 5.9 miles for every minute charging. That's not bad at all. But now after the 50-minute point, it really falls off the cliff here. And we're looking at only 3.3 miles of range added for every minute from 50 minutes to 60 minutes. From 60 to 70, 2.3. From 70 to 80, again, 2.3. And then from 80 to the 90-minute mark, only 1 mile of range added for every minute. And this just demonstrates, as I say over and over again, when you're at a DC fast charger and you're at a high state of charge, like 80, 85%, just unplug and leave. It's not worth your time unless you absolutely need the range to get to your destination. Because take a look at here. For every minute you're waiting after the 50-minute mark, you're averaging like 2 miles of range per minute. That's just not worth your time unless your time isn't worth anything. I know I don't want to sit there and wait for 2 miles of range for every minute I'm charging. unless, as I said, you need that extra range to get to your destination. And finally, we're going to take a look at the how long to add driving range chart. And here, again, I have both columns for EPA range rating and the 70-mile-an-hour highway range test I did. And I'm going to read off the EPA range rating column. Okay, so it took only 5.2 minutes to add 50 miles of driving range. That's outstanding. We added 100 miles of range in 10 minutes. As I said earlier, again, also outstanding, especially considering this is a big 9,000-pound full-size pickup truck that only gets 2 miles per kilowatt hour. So to get 100 miles in 10 minutes, that's really great. 150 miles comes in about 15.7 minutes. You had 200 miles of driving range in 23 minutes. That's still not bad at all. But then we start to slow up a little bit here. It takes 33.9 minutes, just about 34 minutes, to add 250 miles of range. Again, that's not bad. A little more than a half an hour, you add 250 miles of driving range. For a big truck like this, that's pretty good. 300 miles comes at 42.9 minutes, which is just about 43 minutes. You add 300 miles of range. Many EVs can't even go 300 miles. And here in under 45 minutes, you're adding it along a road trip. So it's still pretty good. 350 miles comes at the 52-minute mark, well, 51.9 minutes. And we've really slowed up at this point now. So a little under an hour, you can add 350 miles of driving range. And if you really hang on and wait it out up when the pack is at a high state of charge, you can add 400 miles in an hour and 10 minutes. Next up, I have my 10 to 80% charge recording side by side with this 0 to 100% charge recording. So we could see exactly how each session did in comparison to each other over the same time period. Which one charged faster? Let's check that out now. Okay, so here's the 0 to 100 and 10 to 80% Silverado EV charge recordings I did on a 350 kilowatt EVgo DC fast charger. I'm going to speed up the recordings a lot and stop them at 10-minute intervals just so you can see where we're at every 10 minutes. The 10 to 80% charging session took 40 minutes, so we'll stop the video 4 times and take a look. But in between, I'm going to speed it up really quickly. If you want to see these videos in full, both are available in their full length. The one right here, the 0 to 100, and then my other video that I previously posted shows the 10 to 80% charge recording. Okay, so let's stop it now after 10 minutes of charging on both sessions. The 10 to 80% session is slightly ahead. It's added 23% of the battery, whereas the 0 to 100% session is at 22%. And in that session, the station has dispensed 55.1 kilowatt hour compared to the 56 in the 10 to 80. Super close. The only thing I will note here is if you could see the power draw on the 10 to 80% session just started to taper down like a minute earlier, whereas on the 0 to 100, it's still charging pretty much at the full charge rate of almost 350 kilowatts. And I think this little lead here is because on the 0 to 100% charging session, it took almost a minute for it to get up to the full power draw, whereas on the 10 to 80 it immediately went up. And I think it's possible that the battery was slightly cooler, even though in both instances I preconditioned well before to get the battery at the right temperature. It's possible that it dropped a little bit on the way to the charger, even though I had the preconditioning set, because it seemed like it took maybe 30-40 seconds longer for it to really reach its full charge rate. And that's all you need here to make a 1 kilowatt hour difference. Okay, so let's speed it up now and jump to the point where we've been charging both sessions for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, the 10 to 80% session has opened up its lead a little bit. It's added 44% of the battery compared to 42%, so another percent. And as far as the amount of kilowatt hour, we have 102.1 to 106.2. So after 20 minutes, both sessions have added more than 100 kilowatt hour. That's 200 plus miles of driving range in 20 minutes. Not bad. You will notice on the power draw, the 10 to 80% is still pulling almost 300 kilowatts, whereas the 0 to 100 after 20 minutes is down to only 200 kilowatt, well, 201. And that's where we saw that severe power drop. Now, it happened on the 10 to 80% session also, but it took a minute longer. So when we start this session up again, you're going to see the power drop really quickly. So it had that similar charging profile. It's just on the 10 to 80% session, it happened about a minute later. Okay, let's speed things up now and stop after 30 minutes of charging. Okay, at the half an hour point, the 10 to 80% session has opened up a wider lead, and it now has a 5% state of charge advantage, adding 57% compared to 52%. Now you will notice the kilowatt hour that's been dispensed is quite a bit. It's more than 10 kilowatt hour more. So the 10 to 80% session has definitely been sucking down juice at a slightly higher rate after 30 minutes than the 0 to 100% session. But it is close. You know, every charging session is going to be slightly different here. I don't think that this is enough to say, wow, GM's charging profile is super erratic. I'd like it to be a little bit closer, but as I said, there's other outside factors, battery temperature being one of them. I would have expected the 0 to 100 to be ahead at this point because now we're at a higher state of charge, over 60% state of charge, and you would expect the 10 to 80% session to be slowing down more, which it has at this point. You can see the power draw is 145 kilowatt on the 10 to 80% session, where it's still 162 on the 0 to 100 because it's at a lower state of charge. It's requesting more amps, 215 amps compared to the 187 amps that the vehicle's requesting on the 10 to 80% session. Okay, the next stop is going to be when the 10 to 80% session has completed the charging session because it only took 40 minutes to get 10 to 80%. We'll see where we're at that point. So I stopped the video right at the moment that the station shut off. Now you'll notice it says 79% on the 10 to 80% session, but it's really at 80% at this point because the station lags about 10 or 15 seconds behind what the vehicle is at. So when the charging session ends, it's going to say it was at 79%, but the vehicle was showing 80%. And that's true for the 0 to 100% session also. That's probably at 66%. So it's about a 4% lead right now. The 0 to 100% session gained 1% back. It's starting to catch up to the other session, but the race is over. It took 40 minutes for the 10 to 80% session to add 70% of the battery, and in that 40 minutes, the 0 to 100 only added about 66%. Now it takes only about 3.5 minutes longer to get to 70% of the battery added on the 0 to 100% session. So it took 3.5 minutes longer. That's really nothing to be concerned about as far as I'm concerned. I like to see that the vehicles remain relatively consistent when they charge. And again, this was a different day, different battery temperature, different starting point. So you could expect to see something slightly different. But I am a little surprised that the 10 to 80% session actually beat the 0 to 100% session. I would have expected that session to hit 70% before the 10 to 80% hit 80%. But that's with EV charging. You don't get perfect repeatable results every single time. And as I mentioned earlier, this kind of demonstrates how early on the Silverado EV charges great. That first 20 minutes is awesome, but then it slows up and it's kind of pedestrian at that point. You know, 40 minutes to add 80% of the battery isn't really great. Now, people will say, well, Tom, look, it added 167 kilowatt hours almost. That's a lot. But again, you have to look at the C rate, and it's not impressive as far as the C rate's concerned. I believe, and I think a lot of people believe, GM could pump in the power a lot quicker into the Silverado if they want to, and perhaps they will at a later date. Now let's take a look at how these two charging sessions compare on paper. Okay, so I have the 10 to 80% session represented by the black line and the 0 to 100% by the red line. As you can see, these charging curves are extremely similar. If you could slide the black line over to begin at 0% state of charge, they would be extremely similar. But there are a couple of small differences, I think, that made the 10 to 80% session charge just slightly faster, 3.5 minutes quicker to add 80% of the battery. Number one, if you remember, in the beginning of the 0 to 100% charge session, it took a little bit longer to get to the full 350 kilowatts. As you can see here at the very front edge here, it's more of a rounded edge than the 10 to 80%, where it kind of goes straight up right at 350 and then holds it. It holds it for about the same length on both charging sessions. The difference after that you could see is that on this short ledge here, when the power drops down to around 300 kilowatts, the 10 to 80% session held 300 kilowatts for 2 minutes longer than it did on the 0 to 100% session. And that's really the difference in this charging session. This section here really made the full difference. The rest of the charging session is about the same. It dips down the same way, it hits just about the same bottom, it recovers the same way, but obviously on the 10 to 80% session, it doesn't recover for very long because we're already close to 80% and it's already beginning to do its final ramp down, which it mimics the 0 to 100% pretty closely there. So the whole difference in this was it took maybe a minute longer to get to the full 350 in the very beginning, and then it held the 300 kilowatts for about 2 minutes longer. That's the whole difference. There's your 3.5 minutes difference as far as adding 70% of the battery. Now let's take a look at the time to charge chart. You can see here the 10 to 80% starts at 10%, so it's above the 0 to 100% test. The lines are very similar, except again, the 10 to 80% holds that higher charge a little bit longer. The line is a little bit more vertical for just a little bit longer, just enough to make that difference and give it a little bit more power in that first, say, 20, 25 minutes of charging. And that was I think you remember there's about 10 kilowatt hour more that it pumped in early on, and that made the difference there. But honestly, this isn't something that I think the average person would even notice if they're sitting in their car and charging on a road trip. And speaking of which, if you are taking this vehicle on a road trip, as you can see by this analysis I've done here, you're much better suited driving it down to a super low state of charge and only charging for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes tops, and then unplugging and moving on. Even if you can't make your destination, you're better off hitting up another DC fast charger somewhere down the road when you're at a low state of charge, 10% or less, and staying there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it takes to get you to your destination. You'll get there much quicker. That holds true with a lot of electric vehicles, but some more than others. With the Silverado EV, you definitely don't want to stay more than 20, 25 minutes unless you have to, because you really start getting diminishing returns on your miles per minutes added. That first 20 minutes of charging, you're getting nearly 10 miles for every minute, and then it drops off pretty quickly. So that's my road tripping advice. Drive it down to a low state of charge, plug in for about 20 minutes, unplug, and move on. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at my new master charging chart. With this chart, you can take a look at any 10% block of charging. You could start at 40% and look at 40 to 50%, 40 to 60%. You could start at 30% and look at 30 to 80%. Whatever you want. This is a very useful tool when you're on a road trip, so you could see about how long it's going to take you to charge from a certain state of charge to your finished state of charge. And it also shows in this box, each block shows how many minutes it takes, what the average power draw is going to be, how much of the state of charge you're adding, how many EPA range rated miles you're going to add, and also how many kilowatt hour the battery is going to take in that section. I'm not going to go over all these boxes. There's a ton of data here, but this is something that you can download from my website, evchargingstations.com, and throw it in the glove box, or just take a screenshot off of this video if you're a Silverado EV owner, and you can keep this for future reference if you're on a road trip or driving somewhere and you want to know about how long it's going to take to get from a certain set point to a finished set point of your state of charge, and also how many kilowatt hour it's going to put in the pack. Of course, your mileage may vary and will vary. Each charging session is slightly different, But if you do precondition the battery, you get it to a nice temperature, and you're at a 350 kilowatt DC fast charger, this chart here should be relatively close to what you're going to experience in the field. And of course, on the bottom, you'll see there's a legend. You'll also notice that the boxes are colored, and on the legend, it shows you what that represents. It's the percentage of charging power compared to the maximum charge rate that the vehicle can take in. So if it's that light green color, it's accepting 80 to 100% of its maximum charge rate. You can see the light green's only at the top because it only accepts up to 350 kilowatts when it's at a low state of charge. And as the boxes get down lower to the higher percent state of charge, the color of the boxes change until you get to the red, which is the slowest charging rate, and that's at the very end. I'm not going to go over everything here, but you can download it and take a look at it. It's a lot of useful information on this master charging chart. Okay, well, that's all we have here today for our DC fast charge analysis of the Silverado EV. As I've said, I think multiple times in the video, fantastic charging electric vehicle for the first 20 minutes or so. After that, it can use some improvement. So when you're on a road trip, 20, 25 minutes tops, unplug, move on. And you've already added 200, 250 miles of range. Stop at the next DC fast charger, repeat, do the same thing. Or, that might be enough to get you to your destination. The truck goes over 400 miles, well over 400 miles if you're not towing anything at highway speeds in relatively warm weather. In the winter, it's going to be a little bit less. So, you could start off driving 400 miles and then plug in for 20 minutes. You got another 200 miles. You got 600 miles there with just a 20-minute stop. That should get most people to most of their destinations, unless you're really driving really far. I'm impressed with the Silverado and its sibling. I recently had an opportunity to drive the GMC Sierra Denali. Great truck also, super long range, really fast charging, again, at least for the first 20, 25 minutes or so. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see GM at some point in the future improve the charging curve through software update. It's not unheard of for manufacturers to release a vehicle with a certain charging curve, maybe on a little bit of the conservative side. But then as the vehicle's in customers' hands and they're racking up millions of miles and they're monitoring the battery health with DC fast charging, they can shave some time off of the charging, do a software update, and maybe improve the charging, have it hold a higher charge rate deeper into the pack. I really think that they'll be able to do that because it's such a large pack, and it really does slow up charging a lot once it gets over 50, 60%. I really think that the vehicle should be able to hold over 200 kilowatts up to 80%. I mean, that's a 200 kilowatt hour battery pack, plus it's like maybe 220, 230, the total capacity. So should be able to hold that. And I really wouldn't be surprised if we don't see GM do that at some point in the future. I know they've done multiple updates for the Hummer EV on its DC fast charging. So perhaps we'll see that with Silverado and Sierra at some point in the future also. I hope so, because it's a great charging vehicle, but it can be that much better. And particularly for people towing and traveling long distances, you really want to charge as fast as you can, because with electric vehicles, particularly if you're towing or hauling long distances, you don't want to stop too many times. You'd much rather stay at a charging session up to 80%, because we don't have a lot of pull-through charging stations. And when you're towing, it can be a hassle to line the vehicle up to the charge port and plug in. So I'd love to see it charge much higher rate, deeper into the pack. For those people that are towing long distances, they might be able to cut out one charging stop. But the way it is now, I'd have to recommend unplugging, once you've been charging for 20, 25 minutes, because it really slows up a lot. And with the efficiency of the vehicles being big and heavy, you're really not getting a lot of miles per minute of charging. And that's a shame, because it's such a good truck in so many ways. I'd love to see the DC fast charge performance improve when the vehicle's at higher states of charge. Well, that's all we have here today on the DC fast charging analysis. If this is your first time here at State of Charge, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming electric vehicle news and reviews. And as always, thanks for watching.